Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see everyone here. My name is Andrea Leiter. I am the director of the Amsterdam Center for International Law. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Gina Heathcote to our ACIL lecture series. Professor Heathcote is a professor of public international law at the University of Newcastle, and her research explores the fields of public international law, feminist methodologies, collective security, the law on the use of force, international law of the sea, and the study of gender, sexuality, and the law. Prior to joining Newcastle Law School, she was professor of gender studies and international law at the School of Law, SOAS, University of London. Professor Heathcote has published widely, including monographs on the law of the use of force, a feminist analysis in 2012, feminist dialogues in international law, successes, tensions, futures in 2018, and a 2 volumes edited title on the law of war and peace, a gender analysis, where the second title is coming out in 2026. So this is really hot off the press, so to speak. Her current research analyzes the international law of the sea and maritime security from a feminist perspective, and publications examine feminist legal methodologies for ocean research, queer and post-human feminist understandings of ocean governance, and decolonial encounters with the ocean, maritime technologies, and non-Western legal understandings of ocean care and custodianship. A book on this is coming out equally in 2026. We're just speaking about how prolific someone can be. Wonderful. Professor Heathcote is a recipient of a Leverhulme International Fellowship that runs from 2025 to 27, titled Saltwater Law. And it is a project that examines decolonial legal methodologies and the potential for two-way research methods to shape international law and ocean governance. And right this morning, we had the great pleasure of discussing early career research work undergoing here at ACIL, and this methodological insights that Gina is bringing here were really extremely valuable and helpful for all of us. So thank you for joining also in the morning. With no much further ado, I will say today we will hear from Gina on the theme of gender redux, international legal patterns and repetition. I would say the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the invitation, and for those of you that presented at the workshop this morning, which was definitely a highlight. So thank you for bringing your work to me. I really want to acknowledge the excellence, kind of enjoyment of you this morning. I'm not sure I can be so coherent this afternoon, but I will do my best. In fact, really part of this paper is called Disorder, and I'm so disordered that I'm talking from 3 different sources of my own writing. Apologies in advance, but perhaps that's the theme, and I'll go with that. But before I start, I want to actually acknowledge the Garajari, the Badi, and the Yaru people, as well as the Burung people of the Kulin Nation, whose deep knowledge and understandings of the world have developed some of the thinking that appears here, although I won't be speaking directly really to any of those worldviews or cosmologies. But as you kind of heard in the introduction, there is some work that I'm doing with Indigenous communities in Australia, and that has and it inflects some of the thinking that I present to you today. But also to acknowledge that they land that was never ceded, sovereignty was never ceded, and you know, that I gain and live with the privilege of being a settler in that world as well, or grew up there. So my talk today not only reflects a couple of papers that I'm going to tell you about that I'm kind of in process of writing, which is hence the 3 different papers, but also unexpectedly the privilege of attending 3 different workshops on feminist thinking over the last week, which sounds rather compacted. They kind of all come along at once. One of which was an amazing project called Pluraloguing Feminist Approaches to International Law. So playing on the word of dialogue to actually pluralize dialogues and thinking about feminist voices outside of the global north, and how they actually, rather than theorizing, oh, we need to think about gender and race, or we need to be inclusive, to actually doing that work. Yeah, I know that a former student who I was examiner for was at the heart of that project. And it's a fantastic project, and of course transformed my thinking. And then on Saturday was involved in a celebration of the work of Ratna Kapoor. And I think both of those two things also kind of like drifting through my head, kind of throwing thoughts at me while I try and build coherence here. But I'm also working at the moment on a paper with Dr. Paola Zicchi at Warwick University, Warwick Law School, as part of a British Academy project on a study of global disorder. So a response, institutional response to a kind of contemporary moment of global disorder. And Paola and I together were kind of providing the feminist paper, because it was kind of an open thing. I'm pretty sure we might be the only feminists, queer feminist international lawyers in the conversation. Many of the participants are very mainstream IR scholars, although they did have the audacity to tell us that the Global South wasn't a single place, and could we not refer to the Global South as a single place in our paper. Nobody else mentioned the Global South, but we were the one, you know, they were just talking about Trump. Anyway, that's one project. And then the other is some work around decolonizing international law and thinking about decolonial feminist method. But I want to draw on the paper that Paola and I have been working on, and just give a shout out to Paola's work, her book, Feminist Governance and International Law, A Critical Legal History. So part of what I'm talking about today is thinking about this idea of legal repetitions and legal patterns as part of the work of a decolonial feminist project. It's not only about thinking about which feminists' voices and tools we include, but it's also noticing the repetition of law's violence and the co-option of some feminist projects within that. So I'm going to start with a feminist interrogation of the binary of order and disorder itself, which is something Paola and I do. And I guess the idea of thinking about binaries in our thinking is a kind of long-held feminist tool, but perhaps one that sometimes isn't. Well, it was maybe, I don't know, you don't see that work so often. I think it did come up this morning in our workshop. But thinking with the idea of the binary and going back to that is a really handy feminist tool for lots of reasons. And then we're going to follow this, and we're going to look at two claims around disorder and order. First of all, asked whose disorder? So, you know, that we do live in times of disorder. There's lots of narratives around crisis and disorder at this moment in time, whether it's about climate crisis, whether it's about the rise of fascism and far-right politics, whether it's obviously naming and speaking about the genocide that's ongoing, as well as famine and acts of aggression in the world at this moment in time, sending the kind of West into a spiraling around, look at the moment of disorder that we find ourselves in. But perhaps we need to also pay attention to what else is held in the language of disorder at this moment. Whose disorder? In fact, our paper is Whose Order? Decolonial Feminist Interrogations of Crisis, Stability and International Law. For the colonized, for those living under occupation, even those in post-conflict communities or spaces of ongoing conflict, you don't need Trump or climate change or current forms of state aggression or state-produced famine to experience disorder. In fact, the very articulation of the idea of this as being a moment of disorder ignores or produces, I guess, the latter half of the 20th century as a form of order. And then, of course, from a form of global order, but for who? And I think there is much to be learned from thinking about what forms of disorder were always already present for so many in the world. And then there's that whole, we'll create all our victims elsewhere. But of course, within those spaces of disorder are stories of protest and resistance, survival, different worldviews, different lives that can be lived alongside and within that disorder. So I think this kind of existential crisis for the West and the global North, that there is all this disorder, what are we going to do about it? As opposed to, might we go back to where these forms of law and legal relations and global relations have always persisted and existed, and think about resistance and ways of doing from that position might be more helpful, particularly for feminist projects. And so I guess the second and adjunct claim to that for at least a feminist project is, how is gender central to the civilizing narrative and the displacement of those stories of resistance and protests elsewhere? So what's silenced within a dominant mainstream feminism, and what work has feminists done to create the illusion of order, perhaps at the end of the 20th century or even in the last 2 decades? And that's the kind of work that I want to talk you through today. And then I hope to give a kind of conclusion, but a very short version of this paper on Saturday at Ratner's event. I think I got to the end and I was like, oh my God, thanks, Ratner, you're brilliant. And that was the best I could do. I'm not going to do that today. So I am going to read a little bit from the co-authored paper. So just bearing in mind, this is you'll see which bits are informed by Paola's wonderful research and her critical legal history, particularly of the Mandate period in Palestine, and using that as a tool to kind of critique stories of order and disorder. So the distinction between order and disorder has long served as a central organizing principle in both the theory and practice of international law. And obviously, at this moment in time, amidst Israel's genocide in Gaza, in the wake of October 7th, 2023, Hamas has been identified as a vector of global crisis, threatening to trigger or already triggering wider regional conflict, and maybe even destabilizing the foundations of the international legal order. I feel that there's that new terminology, isn't there? Oh, it's the end of the international rule-based order. Has anyone else heard that? You know, is there an international law that isn't a rule-based order is interesting in and of itself, but end for who? I mean, so many accounts where that international order wasn't a space of order, but was a space of disorder. International institutions continue to sound the alarm on multiple impending crises, condemning the ongoing use of force, the starvation of civilians, and violations of the prohibition against forceful annexation under international law. Yet the same institutions prove unable to secure any kind of ceasefire. I mean, I know we have a ceasefire, but I don't think it's a safe ceasefire for many, let alone peace across multiple territories, as powerful states continue to question the legitimacy of the international legal system. So with Palestine in the background, I want to critically examine the order-disorder binary and challenge dominant narratives of crisis and stability within the global community. I also think, just as an aside, thinking about Hilary Charlesworth's discipline of crisis suddenly emerges again, and that kind of license, we talk about the crisis moment, but not much work looking at what actually is written in that paper, which is about a law of every day and the need to think about the experience of everyday insecurity, again, which I think is an important feminist kind of qualifier of the kind of crisis language. So using a gendered lens to analyze the relationship between global order and disorder, can we articulate and notice how feminist governance and projects of gender law reform have reinforced existing power structures, including colonial and racial hierarchies? So the complicity of feminist governance in reinforcing global hierarchies require us to pay attention to the diversity of global South feminist perspectives and challenge and reimagine the very foundations of global order. So that we move from dominant Western perspectives and their role in historically legitimizing institutional narratives of stability progress. So I want to suggest we can make a couple of arguments. First of all, that dominant forms of feminist governance, far from operating outside of the structures of global order, have served to legitimize and stabilize pre-existing systems of power, including colonial and patriarchal hierarchies. And that the dominant Western-centric frames of gender law reform and feminist advocacy have masked enduring inequalities, rendering invisible the counter-narratives and contestations of non-elite women, of Indigenous and anti-colonial feminist approaches, thus leaving feminism absent of any kind of confrontation of the legacies and logics of colonialism, racism, and civilizing missions in their own kind of production of the international order. So through examining the case study of Mandate Palestine during the interwar period, we can look at how international Western feminist campaigns for gender law reform regarding family law, penal laws, the regulations of labor and sexuality, and this is drawn from Ziki's wonderful research and archival research on this, are evidenced as historically mobilized, not as tools for people's liberation, but rather as technologies of local management designed to stabilize the colonial order and suppress or ignore more radical challenges to the status quo. So in Mandate Palestine, transnational feminist actors produced legal interventions around family law supported by what Ziki calls proto-governance feminist projects. So often governance feminist projects kind of align with the kind of late 20th century, maybe emerging. First, you see the Western women's movement sort of telling a story from CEDAW, then through the kind of late decades of the 20th century as a kind of emergence towards the governance feminism that we inherit in the new century. But Ziki's work tells us of how those feminist interventions have kind of trajectories backwards into Mandate Palestine, and how transnational feminist projects were part of the civilizing mission, and also the displacement of alternative feminist voices. So Palestine becomes a litmus test and clear, where it becomes clear that the very notion of peace carried different meanings for different actors. While for Jewish Zionists, this revolved around securing a haven and a national homeland. For Palestinian Arabs, a genuine peace was inseparable from resistance to colonial dispossession and the fulfillment of national rights. So it's in this context that the role of proto-governance feminists who might have helped bridge these divides were not neutral. And in fact, Ziki's voice shows us that even as Western feminists lobbied for gender equality and peace, their silence, or at times active participation in civilizing missions, enabled the reproduction of racial and social hierarchies, often justifying legal reform as necessary for backward societies. The order they sought to construct depended on constructing others as pathological, in need of saving, or simply as obstacles to overcome on the march towards progress and stability. And the imposition and forced universalization of Western models at the expense of more pluralistic and alternative approaches to law and justice masked both historical and ongoing exclusions at the intersection of gender, race, and sexuality. And these exclusions might, and an exploration of these might lay the groundwork for ongoing debates on intersectionality, legal pluralism, and the role of feminisms in broader struggles for international justice. What's important, I think, is at that moment when transnational feminist networks were suddenly gripped with the rise of fascism in Europe at the end of the 1930s, those same transnational feminists, when scholars from the global south, Arab women's networks were like, we understand what's going on here, and Paula Ziki's work looks into this. That is the moment when those same feminists say, we haven't got time for your stories of resistance. We're fighting in Europe now against fascism. And so there is a kind of refusal of the transnational and global feminist solidarity. Unlike the 1930s and 1940s, scholars, policymakers, activists today can acknowledge, listen, and learn with the communities, peoples, and states who know intimately the disciplining effects of a narrow conception of gender. And so as we details the complex relationship between gender and the rise of the global right, anti-gender agendas of populism, the forms of violent gender attacks and restrictions are part of aggression at this moment, there are already stories of resistance and living with these forms of violence that I think require increased attention to. So perhaps as an example, one of the most prolific feminist wins, probably, you know, I've talked about this a lot in my own work, has been the crafting, so to come back to the present, crafting, amendment and embedding of 10 resolutions on women, peace and security in the work of the United Nations Security Council. And I think what's been so distressing in the moment of a genocide, or also famines and extreme violence in different parts of the world, has been the absolute failure and absence of WPS in that moment. In fact, it's a sort of a moment where WPS is itself withering away. So WPS, the Women, Peace and Security agenda at the Security Council, has for the last 20, 25 years been about addressing and insisting on the importance of recognizing the gender dimensions of conflict and the importance that gender be applied to all aspects of decision-making and conversations, at least in the international sphere, in the United Nations Security Council, around conflict and post-conflict issues, that gender be part of that. But of course, the resolutions are limited in the types of gender law reform that they construct, prioritizing liberal feminist agendas that assume women in the global south are always victims rather than agents, that there is always a case for women in need of special protection, often women paired with children, and then a programming of kind of looking at empowerment and participation and inclusion for elite women. So I guess it's not surprising that there's a silence on WPS at this moment, but what I want to also suggest is actually it's not just a silence. I feel like WPS is waiting in the wings as well. So what happens in the post-conflict moment? We can already see the groundwork for a kind of resurgent WPS, a carceral feminism, prosecuting specific forms of conflict-related sexual violence, spaces for elite women to move into decision-making moments as part of the humanitarian post-conflict moment. What I would argue is that these are repetitions of the forms of colonial interventions that are perhaps examined in multiple case studies, with the one here that I've talked about in Mandate Palestine, where a specific mode of feminist intervention becomes attached to certain moments of global order or the production of global order. So no surprise that when you're looking at Mandate Palestine, you're also looking at the order being built at the end of World War I. But we might also look at 2001 or from 1998 to sort of 2005, when you have, again, a huge international kind of angst around the failure of the global order and this disorder that is sort of jointly connected to what happened in Iraq in 2003, the Kosovo intervention in 1998 and 9/11 in 2001. So is this the end of the international order? And then a kind of resurgent international order that includes WPS and these same kind of modes of operating that Ezekiel identifies as a proto-governance feminism through the example of Mandate Palestine. So an alternative approach to understanding gender as both central to global disorder and to the forms of order constructed in the international legal edifice across the 20th century is to recognize and name the particular legal forms that have been hoisted as international and universal and gender neutral, and to describe those gendered forms that fall outside of that story. So rather than looking for alternative feminist voices as if they're just to be discovered now, to understand that these have been ongoing spaces of resistance throughout any sort of international feminist project. But it seems difficult and complicated to work with all that. How does a feminist scholar at once hold the idea that the success stories in international law are continually flawed and in repetition because of their co-option and legitimation of colonial governance project, racialized projects in international law, civilizing projects, humanitarianism? It's kind of a cloak for that in at least the 21st century. And at the same time, pay attention to alternative feminist forms and their modes and methods and stories and histories. So that's kind of where I'm at and what I think about. It gives me lots to think about. And so I want to draw really on thinking on the work that Ratna Kapoor has been doing all along that we might think of as an important tool. So you could go back to her amazing piece which I always mistitle, on the tragedy of victimization rhetoric, where she talks about the idea of the peripheral subject not as one to be saved, and also describes in great detail the way human rights law in particular encodes a form of gender and victim essentialism within like feminist projects, and asks us to really take seriously the worldview of the peripheral subject, so the subject that might be otherwise constructed as victim to be saved in feminist work, to ask us what tools we need to actually see the normative universe of those that are furthest away from us, and to ask us to take that seriously. I think that's very, very difficult, although for me it's an important starting point or returning point if we don't want to do the repetition of a civilizing gender project. I think Kapoor's a more recent book on gender alterity and human rights, Freedom Beyond the Fishbowl of Liberalism, I think that's a misquoted title, but it is the fishbowl of liberalism that she talks about, where she really lets us know and shows us a technique that other worldviews are available, despite liberalism's attempt to kind of define itself as always kind of closing in and including alternative or formerly excluded voices. I think her deep commitment to legal pluralism, so that a kind of attention to an alternative worldview that is attentive to the legal tools that are available in those spaces is really quite important, especially if we want to move beyond a feminist kind of project that's entwined with a certain type of order making that requires feminized victims, that also requires some women to kind of enter the spaces, voices of feminism, but obviously kind of from a very narrow group. So that with Kapoor's practice in mind, I sort of was thinking, well, who is writing on this moment, returning to Palestine, thinking about genocide, and where are the gendered voice or the feminist and gender voices on this? And I could find a lot of descriptions of women in the global south, whether in Sudan or in Gaza at the moment, or even Ukraine, often as these kind of victims that are really waiting for a post-conflict moment, as if they are waiting for a post-conflict moment when there might be some carceral kind of mode to hold perpetrators to account. But amongst that, actually one that stood out was the writing of Bana Gardbian, who is a Syrian scholar, and she has a piece in Third World Quarterly called Re-Indigenizing Feminism, Gender, Genocide, and Gaza. And she writes, I write with a longing for a material solution beyond discursive intervention, academic articles, and theoretical frameworks. I write wishing I could see the sky without smoke, and wishing for cleaner lungs and a city that is not vulnerable to bombs. I've been really sitting with this about like the huge difference to listen to a feminist voice writing from Syria and still thinking about the smoke kind of dissipating in the air. And what of my own feminist privileges are literally kind of inscribed in that, to sort of sit in cities without bombs. In fact, she writes of the necessity for a Western feminist project that unlearns settler logics. And I take this seriously. This is directed at me. And I don't think it would be okay for me to suggest that I am somehow immune to Western feminist approaches. So this is a self-critique as much as anything. And I think there's this risk of a discursive move as a white feminist, as a European descent Australian, to think that as long as I'm critiquing it, I'm immune to it and I am outside of that. So I've been thinking about unlearning and understanding one's complicity in genocide as a preceding kind of aspect that needs to be spoken by Western feminists. So it's not just I can describe the histories of proto-feminist governance, and therefore, again, I'm not inside them, and think much more seriously about my relationship to that. And Gardbian makes a call to know the land, or a reckoning of quotidian violence, of song, of narrative, of resistance and solidarity, informed by an embodied everyday environmental and Indigenous feminist praxis, what I would call a plural feminism that resists the frames of participation, victim subjects, or gendered essentialism, to write in the peripheral subject as voice, as side of praxis, and as the space for my unlearning. And so to think about my city as not vulnerable to bombs, but to not see that as that there isn't smoke screens, perhaps here in the cities, well, not, I've moved cities, I was in London, but now even here. So although Gabian writes from Syria, fire, protest, racism and poverty create other smoke screens amongst the illusion of security and money in Europe. Indeed, my own personal history across a number of cities in the global north tells histories of manufacturing of armaments shipped around the world. Newcastle, my newest city, of decision-making spaces intervening abroad in the name of global humanitarianism. So London, where I've lived for a long time prior to Newcastle, or a state which intervenes in its own communities to displace and destroy Indigenous worldviews. So a long time I lived in Canberra, the capital city of Australia. Or cities that simply deny the existence of Indigenous histories of those cities. So I grew up in Melbourne, where there is a long history of settler violence. And what I mean by that is the city of Melbourne was built by settlers claiming land and displacing Indigenous communities, which is a reminder that when I look at Gaza, and we might talk about settlements in Gaza, that those techniques and maneuvers are not unique to what's happening in Gaza. In fact, they have been enacted elsewhere in different forms and kind of ongoing. Indeed, the settler colony of Australia has a long and ongoing history of the criminalisation and incarceration of Indigenous communities, including their children. Again, the settler colony travels, and its techniques, its legal techniques, travel and persist and repeat. Or the lingering environmental harm that forestalls a life after the settler moves in. It's not new to the moment that we're in now. So I guess thinking about the smoke screens of safety and security, the illusion of order that we sit within, I want to argue is part of an important feminist project, not of only kind of learning with or unlearning with different worldviews, peripheral subjects, if we take from Kapoor, but to also ask different types of questions of self. I've probably run out of time, have I? I've got a little bit of time. Good, because I've still got more to go. So I want to return to this idea of WPS as seemingly absent in kind of stories of global order and disorder at this moment, but yet perhaps just waiting for this moment. I really feel it's waiting in the wings. You know, what happens in the next moment, and will there be a return to WPS? I've always said women, peace and security is only ever about the post-conflict moment and never about the conflict moment. There's no women in decision-making spaces around this kind of moment of global disorder. Well, there are some women, but not the women that women, peace and security would bring there. And I want to argue that actually we need to, at this moment, think about alternative feminist futures in the global space, because a return to WPS, which would involve a fixation on post-conflict prosecutions, so carceral projects, empowerment via seats on decision-making tables for some women, and an elite feminist worldview as central to the civilizing mission of order and reconstruction thereafter. And yet, if we go back to Mandate Palestine, we know that transnational feminists past have had the opportunity to ask different questions during the moment of disorder. So going back to this moment of the end of the League of Nations, when, you know, the kind of proto-feminist governance projects that had been allowed as part of the ordering that was the League of Nations, at the moment of the rise of fascism in Europe, disavows women from the Global South and feminist networks from the Global South to say this, actually what's happening in Europe is taking our attention now. We can't learn anything from you. But in fact, colonialism, occupation, post-conflict interventions past have built and allowed other feminist projects to thrive, and we look away from them with I guess our ignorance, or with, you know, a repeat of feminist projects that will be civilizing rather than world making. So to close, too short or joking? I probably would prefer to talk to you all about this.
Yeah.
Abolitionist, eco-feminist, queer, Indigenous, anti-colonial feminists are not new feminist voices, but rather these are the racialized feminist exclusions, civilizing feminist exclusions that are always present in the moment of order, and that we might pay more attention to the moment of disorder.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Super.